Is the MPC One still worth it? The short answer is probably. The long answer is a bit more interesting. What's up and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. I've been using the MPC as my primary music production station for over a year now, and it's been over a year since my initial review of it, which kind of popped off. And since then, my opinions on it have both become more positive, but also more complicated. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I want to recommend this thing. I really do, but I have some serious reservations as well. Someone recently asked me if I could only keep one of my groove boxes, one of my kind of like all-in-one music production stations, which one would I keep? That's a really hard question to answer, and I would probably try to keep two because I would want like a workstation and then a portable one, but one of those would probably be the MPC One. When I want to do kind of proper production, it is the first thing that I reach for these days. It gives me enough power to do the stuff that I want, but at the same time, it is hands-on enough to satisfy what I want out of a music production setup. That's going to be different for different people, and there are certain workflows that have kind of calcified for me that make it as hands-on as I want it to be, which I've showed on the channel before, and I'm going to go into that a bit more today. But regardless, the MPC One is one of my absolute go-tos, and I really don't see that changing, even with the reservations I'm about to mention, because while at the moment it is a device that I would happily keep as one of my main devices and kind of maybe be okay with getting rid of other stuff, there are some things that make me worry about its ability to be future-proofed. And its future-proofing is one of the things that made me think that it would be kind of the responsible thing to do to re-review this thing or re-evaluate it after my very positive video about it kind of blew up. So first of all, let's talk about what it allows me to do and how I like to use it, because there are a few different aspects, and it really ticks a lot of the boxes that I look for in a music production experience. First of all, if I want to flip samples, this is pretty much my go-to because, I mean, it's an MPC. It's really built with that in mind, and it gives you all the tools that you need. And because you can insert an SD card, you can load as much stuff as you want onto it by just dragging and dropping. It's very easy. It's pretty much frictionless to load sounds onto this thing and then just have them at your fingertips. So in the case of the beat that you heard in the intro, I'm flipping a sample made and sent to me by Connor, aka King Chemist. I'm going to link his latest beat tape in the description. I highly recommend giving that a listen. He and I are working on some sort of collaborative project slowly over time. He sent me a bunch of samples where he ran virtual instruments through a bunch of effects, exported them, and then gave me kind of free reign to just do what I want with them. And then eventually I'm going to export those stems and send them back to him. It'll be a back and forth. It'll be great. And that probably says something about how much I kind of lean on this thing these days, that my first thought was to load those samples that he sent me into this thing and to flip them on the MPC. So in terms of sample flipping, you've got automatic chopping, you've got your lazy chopping, you can kind of do stuff a little more manually. In this case, I've pitched this stuff around. And done a bit of time stretching. Having that all at your fingertips is really nice. Also, pro tip, if you want to get really granular with dialing in where your chop is at, you can cycle through the cue links and use the top knob to really get specific with dialing in where your chop ends up, which is nice. Get used to using this button, by the way. I ignored it for the longest time, which was, as it turns out, very silly, because a lot of people say, well, this is a touchscreen and it doesn't feel that hands-on. Why not just use an iPad? I mean, for one thing, this gives you a lot more control than any iPad app I've used. And it gives me control in a way that I like better than any iPad app I've used. And of course, it's got physical buttons, lots of physical buttons and physical knobs. I tried the original MPC Live, and one of the things that I really didn't like about it was the comparative lack of buttons. And based on what I've used so far, the way that the buttons and especially the knobs are integrated into the workflow is a lot cleaner and a lot more seamless than it would be with just a generic MIDI controller connected to a DAW. That's not a knock against DAWs, by the way, because this basically is one. I just personally like the way that the cue links and the various buttons and the screen interact. Obviously, I will use the touchscreen for stuff, and I have gotten pretty fast with basic functions. For instance, let me just show you, say, this drum program. Like, if I want to copy and paste notes around, or maybe like grab individual notes and scoot them around to get like an unquantized feel or just make quick little edits, you can get pretty fast with that, surprisingly so. So in this case, we've got our sample chop, we've got our drums. We've got our 808. I'll get back to that in a second. What I want to draw your attention to here is my favorite trick to make working with this thing even more immediate. Check out a software called Kit Maker. What it does is it either can take folders full of samples and automatically collate them into MPC kits. That way you can just go into browse. In this case, I've got my SD card selected. In this case, I could go to, say, this Ramzoid sample pack, and I've just got a bunch of kits from a sample pack that I bought, in this case from a producer that I like. Or you can even convert machine kits into MPC kits, also using the software. I've got a bunch of machine kits laying around from when I was using the Machine Plus, from when I was using the Machine Micro a bit more often, and from a semi-recent sale that Native Instruments did. So I've converted all of these to MPC kits that I can now just load in, and that's what this is in this case. And I've swapped out a few of the samples, and I've also copied a few of the samples. So for instance, this hi-hat, I have just copied this pad over to this pad, and then made some modifications. I typically like to just go in, bring in, say, the sample I'm gonna flip, and then bring in a few different drum kits, and then I can just start assigning them to tracks, and then just go ham very quickly. Very little setup cost, if that makes sense. And because each of these has 4 plugin slots and all of this editing, including their own envelopes, LFOs, all that kind of stuff. These envelopes and LFOs, by the way, are kind of a big deal to have in a device like this. This gives you all of the power that you would have in a device like a Digitact in something that does a lot more than the Digitact does and is, of course, polyphonic. And if you only ever worked with samples, you'd still have more than enough to shape them into synth-type sounds and just go to town. For a couple of quick examples, first of all, for this hi-hat roll, I have the LFO sent to both pitch and pan. So it bounces around in your ears. Or for a much more extreme example, I did a video recently where I recorded a stylophone, the cheapest synth I could possibly find, into this thing, and turned those sounds into some more kind of proper synth sounds using only the built-in features of this, specifically the envelopes, the LFOs, and the effects. So a few variations of this sound can turn into stuff like this big old bass. So doing stuff like stacking multiple instances of these just kind of basic saw-ish wave samples and then running them through a filter envelope and adding effects, that stuff together can give you some proper synthesis that feels pretty hands-on and was only derived from samples. These are from the same samples. Or we've got some LFO action. And once again, with the same samples as our basis, a pluck. And of course, you can take this a whole lot farther, but hopefully this is a nice illustrative example. Typically, I don't need to load up that many kits and that many key group programs, and that means that the MPC can kind of handle whatever I throw at it. This is an aspect of the MPC One that I gassed up quite a bit in my initial review of it, and it's something that I now want to put some important caveats on, because the cracks have begun to show a little bit, and I'll get into why in a second. But first, I've used both the Machine Plus and the MPC One, and it might be tempting to say that the MPC One is more powerful. After all, for a long time, I hit my CPU limit on the MPC One a lot less often than I did on the Machine Plus. And I eventually realized that is not because the CPU on the MPC One is beefier. It's not. Here are the actual specs for comparison. The reason that the Machine Plus often felt less optimized or it got overloaded more easily is because they put fewer boundaries on what you are allowed to load. For instance, if you load up a machine kit, it will often not only have samples in it, but it will also have, say, massive or FM8 presets, which use up a lot more processing power than samples. Samples are pretty light on the processor in this case. So on the MPC One, if you just go ham loading in samples, you're probably going to be just fine. And it also caps the number of virtual instruments, so it kind of like fences you in to make sure you don't overload it, or at least they make it difficult for you to overload it. If you want to see someone push a standalone MPC to its limits to discover what those limits are, I'll link a midlife synthesist video at the end of this one. But you can load in quite a bit into this thing before it starts to chug, which is nice. And of course, we don't have Massive or FM8 or any of the like native instruments plugins in this thing, which is of course a bummer, but also it means that if you're just loading in a bunch of samples, including beefy key group programs, you're probably going to be able to throw whatever you want at it and be just fine. However, I have mentioned that the cracks are starting to show a bit, and that is due to the addition of the new paid plugins that you can buy specifically for the standalone MPCs. For instance, I'm going to show you this beat here, and you'll notice that now it's bringing up this loading multiple plugins screen that wasn't there before they added the new paid plugins, and only shows up with the new paid plugins. And we've done multiple jump cuts here and it's still freaking going. That's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's definitely a sign that this thing is getting pushed harder than it was originally meant to. And now that everything has loaded, here's just a fairly simple lo-fi beat. And I've got some strings as well. And note that I unloaded these, but just as is right now, our CPU usage is not crazy, but it jumps up when it's actually playing. And the memory is over half full with only a few of the new plugins in here. And I'm like not even pushing this that hard. So if you intend to buy the new paid plugins, for one thing, I will always say this, I highly recommend just cherry picking a single one that's really calling you and just ignoring the rest. Or just ignoring them all, because a device like this is capable of running them, but it's definitely going to be taxing on a device like this. They're pushing it to its limits, and I still think that this is a fantastic device without the paid plugins, and in fact, is definitely a little smoother to use without the paid plugins. They do sound nice, though. I do especially like using Fabric for kind of lo-fi stuff. There are also several built-in free plugins, and I actually do use these quite a bit, especially HypeSynth. I found it to be super useful. This leads me to my second use case for the MPC One. I mentioned that my first use case is whenever I want to make hip hop or anything that involves sample flipping, this is what I reach for, hands down. I also like to make some kind of more glitzy electronic music with it because its built-in plugins like Hype are not bad. They're not crazy processor intensive. Like, let me just unmute literally everything I have. I'm not using a ton of CPU or a ton of memory. And what we have is decent. It kind of covers all your bases. And once again, sound design on this thing is maybe not the most intuitive or hands-on. I'll often just reach for presets and then modify them, but it's there, which is really nice to have. And I like that they've continually added to the repertoire of plugins for free until recently. And that is something that does concern me a little bit. The fact that they have decided to start upcharging for, it seems like, some of the more major upgrades. I understand why. It's a business decision that I totally get, but I don't like the idea that potentially more and more upgrades for this thing might get locked behind a paywall. That might not be so much of a problem, though, because of the next reason that I worry about the future-proofedness of this thing. Every update lately, they seem to break stuff. And I don't mean minor stuff, I mean core features. Over the course of the last major update, they've released 4 patches for it, and all of them have broken and fixed something different. And that's not even a new experience for people who are used to the Akai ecosystem. Among other things, they've completely broken the splice integration, they've broken aspects of sample chopping, they've broken the looper, and then they fixed aspects of those and then introduced new crashing, new instability, and they just absolutely cannot seem to get their shit together. I understand that if you have maybe a small team and limited resources, that QA and QC is difficult. And I understand that building a niche hardware device is a risky investment, and I have no doubt that this is probably a complicated beast to try to program and debug. However, I, from the very beginning, felt like the MPC was built by a bunch of very talented people who just like didn't talk to each other. Like there are certain functions that are nice on their own, but just not really well integrated. And that has become more and more obvious as new updates have been rolled out that added cool new effects plugins and new features, and then just broke core stuff. That's a shaky foundation to be building on, which is why I have such hesitation recommending this thing. Also because like aspects of the workflow are clunky, but I have come around to it quite a bit to the point that I think that you could just get used to it if you are willing to put in some time and build up that muscle memory. It absolutely is possible. Like my muscle memory on this thing for just my core features that I use all the time has gotten to the point that I don't even think about using this thing anymore. I hated it for my first week, came to like it, and now I actually love the workflow, most of it. The interface still has some definite jank, still has a lot of feature creep, and at this point, Akai seems to just break it no matter what they do. No matter what direction they go in, they like break something else. Their programmers are like bulls in a freaking china shop, which once again makes me nervous to recommend this. I still hesitantly do, because I've gotten a lot of genuine joy out of it, but building your studio around this thing is kind of risky. Fortunately, it is a piece of hardware, and so you can just choose not to upgrade it if you want. And if you upgrade it and you hate it, I think there's not been a situation where you couldn't downgrade, as far as I know. That, of course, could change, but like because it's hardware, you can just let it be static. It's good as is right now. Like as of the 2.10 update, which a lot of people are sticking with rather than upgrading to 2.11, it's a very good, fairly complete device that doesn't need anything else to be added to it. And so a lot of people are just opting not to. And they can't force you to upgrade either, because to connect to the internet, you have to connect this to an Ethernet cable. That initially seems like a limitation and a downside, which in many respects it still is, but that also means that if you find out that the latest update breaks stuff, especially core features that you rely on, you can just ignore it. And you're probably good to use this on an earlier build if, say, the newer firmware updates just keep deteriorating. So that's why I still feel okay about recommending this, but Akai is owned by InMusic. InMusic is notorious for making very price competitive gadgets with a lot of jank to them. That's kind of their whole thing. Like Exhibit A is the drum kit behind me, which is by Alesis, also owned by InMusic. Same deal. Very price competitive. It's like, I can't believe I'm getting something that stacks up to the big boys in terms of the features it offers at this low a price. And then it goes to, I can't believe that I've connected this via USB to my computer and my computer just doesn't receive any info. Like, it used to work fine and then it just stopped. That's a tangent though. Hopefully you can see why I'm conflicted about recommending the MPC One. On one hand, it's very price competitive still. Like, it's still quite a bit cheaper than the Machine Plus. And if you are willing to endure a bit of a steeper learning curve, I think it is quite comparable, other than the fact that it doesn't have the proprietary Native Instruments plugins and has more jank to its workflow. On the other hand, it feels a bit like I'm actively building my studio on a foundation of sand. But if that is the case, I've been pretty happy with the sandcastles I've been able to build with this thing. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see that midlife synthesis video I mentioned a bit earlier, you can click or tap up over here. And if you'd like to see a ton more sample flipping, you can click or tap down over here. That will give you an even better idea of, like, in the real world, how I use this thing. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.